More cascading layoffs at Ford and Stellantis this morning because of the ongoing UAW strike against all three automakers. This as the UAW says it's time to change tactics and calling for all allies to come walk the picket line this morning.
The UAW strike keeps chugging along, but with no new walkouts announced this week. Yet, the side effects of the strike continue to grow. It's the OEM suppliers. They're on the brink of collapse, and hundreds of layoffs you see every day are evidence of the far-reaching implications of Shawn Fain's campaign against Detroit's automakers. It wasn't but today when 150 more workers were laid off by Ford at their Sterling axle plant.
Overnight, Ford saying that they're laying off another 150 employees in Michigan. The company says the United Auto Workers Union walkout last week at its Kentucky plant prompted the decision. Since the start of the strike last month, Ford has laid off over 2,700 employees.
These recent layoffs bring the number of laid-off workers at the Sterling axle plant alone to 418, and the total number of laid-off Ford employees rose to 2,730. What about General Motors? They're doing the exact same thing, and from the first week of the strikes. That's when they shut down the Fairfax assembly and stamping plant. That was on the 20th of September, and it put 2,000 employees out of a job. The reason? It's the UAW strike on the Wentzville assembly plant, which provides parts to Fairfax. This came as a result of the plan that UAW President Shawn Fain put into motion months ago. The byproduct of these very specific and tactical strikes can be summed up in a press release sent out by Ford last night. It reads as follows. Our production system is highly interconnected, which means that UAW's targeted strike strategy has knock-on effects for facilities that are not directly targeted for a work stoppage. In this case, the strike at Kentucky truck plant has directly impacted some operations at Sterling axle plant. This layoff is a consequence of the strike because Sterling axle plant must reduce its production of parts that would normally be shipped to Kentucky truck plant. The thing is though, both facilities are unionized by the UAW, but they're only paying strike pay for Kentucky truck plant workers, not Sterling. And for the GM situation, only the Wentzville employees are getting strike pay, and those 2,000 Fairfax employees go home without any support from the union.
As for the UAW talks continued, we're told that they're active, but they're not producing much. The ripple effect continues as we're seeing now the strike impact spreading.
Over at General Motors, it's the only company to close an entire assembly plant because of the strike affecting another. The Fairfax, Kansas plant is quiet, laying off just under 1,600. The Lockport, New York components plant sent home 48 workers. Toledo Propulsion laid off 426. And then there's the Marion Metal, Parma Metal Centers, along with the Lansing stamping plant, laying off nearly 250 more. And General Motors now has more than 2,300 workers off the job due to the strike.
Fain knew this would happen when he chose his strike strategy, that factories that are upstream or downstream in the supply chain would have to eventually shut down and force all those workers to go without pay. You might ask the question, why not just send the whole union on strike so they could all get their strike pay? I can answer that by saying, well, it would mean he would have to pay 140,000 union workers $500 a week. A person would like to reply, asking how long the UAW could hold out for if that was to happen. The answer is about 10 to 11 weeks. And if you aren't really familiar with the UAW strike history, I can't fault you there because there hasn't been many recently. But if you do look back at the previous strikes to try to gauge how long strikes usually last, the GM strike in 2019, it lasted 6 weeks. The GM strike in 2007, it lasted just a few days. The 1970s UAW strike lasted 2 months, and the 1945-46 UAW strike lasted 4 months. Now that you know the historical durations, you might start thinking that Shawn Fain is knowingly and willingly putting UAW members out of work with no union pay because he thinks he might need to draw out this strike for as long as possible, even though most strikes don't last the 10 to 11 weeks the union couldn't afford if it were to give strike pay to every single member from its $825 million fund. If I was Ford, GM, and Stellantis, I would be worried. But these two instances I mentioned are for unionized suppliers. There are plenty of other Tier 1, 2, and Tier 3 suppliers not unionized and grappling with the same reality.
Auto suppliers are bearing the brunt of the ongoing strike. Analysts estimate they've lost more than $2.5 billion in the first month of the strike alone. CBS Detroit's Andres Gutierrez is outside the Ford assembly plant in Wayne with some insight from industry leaders who say the government needs to step in to help out those suppliers.
So far, Ford has laid off more than 2,500 workers because of the strike here in Wayne, Chicago, and Kentucky. An industry expert says there is a multiplier effect, meaning for every worker on the picket line or laid off, there are 7 to 10 other jobs impacted in the community, including suppliers.
Pretty serious situation right now.
Going into the strike, auto suppliers were in a fragile state, recovering from supply chain issues from the pandemic and chip shortages. Now, a month in, suppliers are facing significant disruptions.
There's not a lot of inventory in the system, so things move very efficiently. So if there's a work stoppage at an OEM assembly plant, and we have 36,000 people out at assembly plants now, it's going to directly impact the suppliers very quickly.
If you think the 140,000 UAW workers sounds like a lot of people, you'll be blown away when I tell you the automotive supply chain employs 900,000, 6 times the amount of the UAW. And in a recent survey done by the Vehicle Supply Chain Association, asking their OESs or original equipment suppliers how they're faring during the strike, they found the situation is dire. The survey showed that 39% of suppliers have been forced to lay off employees. In the companies that haven't laid anyone off yet, half of those are planning to begin layoffs by the month's end. 30% of the suppliers have stated they'll need weeks to ramp up production whenever the strike ends, and most troubling, 80% of the respondents to the survey indicated they're concerned about the financial viability of their sub-suppliers. This brings us to the idea of tiers. I talk about differently tiered suppliers a lot, and it just describes a supply chain in some respect. In terms of the automotive world, the Tier 1 suppliers are typically large, well-established companies with strong financials. Examples of a Tier 1 supplier would be Bosch, Denso Corporation, and Magna International. They would supply finished product like a transmission or a sensor that the OEMs can just drop into a car. Then you have Tier 2 suppliers, and they usually supply products to the Tier 1 in the form of a component that would make the finished product. An example of a Tier 2 supplier can be Infineon or NXP, who provide semiconductor chips that a Tier 1 places on a board for a control module. Lastly, we have the Tier 3s, who are responsible for providing raw materials such as aluminum or steel, and even though they're far down on the chain, the strikes have negatively affected these companies as well. Can you guess how long it took from the day the strike started to when U.S. Steel had to lay off 300 to 500 workers after shutting down their Granite City furnace? It took just 3 days.
But for the suppliers who make parts for these plants, they say they already have to start thinking about layoffs. U.S. Steel on its website saying they are idling a blast furnace at a St. Louis area plant. What does that mean? Well, the local steelworkers union telling our affiliate KSDK up to 350 workers they believe could be laid off as a result.
And though I point out U.S. Steel, every supplier, especially those lower on the totem pole, need to make swift decisions, and that is why you're seeing thousands of layoffs. A consultant to the automotive industry, Harbor Results Incorporated, stressed the need for companies to wind down operations sooner rather than later, as ramping operations back up after the strike will consume most of their cash. Harbor can be quoted sharing a warning to their clients. A study of the health of small to medium-sized manufacturers based on their 2022 performance found that nearly 30% of the respondents were in poor financial health, or what we call unbankable, and another 21% are somewhat bankable, with unbankable meaning no bank or business or individual would be willing to lend or invest in their company. Jan Griffiths of Gravitas Detroit echoes Harbor's concerns in this interview with CBS News.
Jan Griffiths, the founder of Gravitas Detroit, worked in supply chain management for more than 3 decades, and she understands all too well the effects a labor strike can have on Tier 1 and especially Tier 2 suppliers. Additionally, she says Tier 2 is still feeling the effects from the pandemic.
The Vehicle Suppliers Association is no less aware and has been petitioning the White House to immediately provide emergency financial assistance, be it low-cost loans or grants, while also creating a training program to help retain workers during the shift to an electric vehicle future. Speaking of EVs, how's that sector faring in the face of a possible supply chain disaster? It's hard to say, of course, as we don't have access to the names of the companies that Tesla works with to create their cars, but if you're a shareholder of Tesla, I think you can rest easy. From the company's inception, vertical integration and getting their influence deep into their supply chain has been paramount.
If you think about an electric vehicle, it's a very simplified vehicle, right? There are less moving parts.
An internal combustion engine can have as many as 2,000 moving parts, while an EV powertrain has as few as 20.
It takes 40% less labor to assemble, so that means there will be fewer jobs in those areas.
It helps that an electric vehicle drivetrain is much simpler in the terms of numbers of parts. Tesla makes their own motors, along with other integral components like electronics and batteries. Tesla CEO, Elon Musk, was quoted on an earnings call commenting on his company's effort in making much of the car in-house as possible. He said, "We're designing and building so much more of the car than other OEMs, who would largely go to traditional supply base and, like I call it, catalog engineering. So it's not very adventurous, and it basically ends up like older parts end up, looking the same, because they're going to the same suppliers. There's probably in excess of a dozen startups effectively in Tesla, designing and making our own power electronics, manufacturing our own motors, chargers, and the supercharger network is a startup. The thing I think people just don't really understand about Tesla, it's a whole chain of startups." And though many analysts would lump Tesla in with other EV manufacturers, even the likes of Rivian face supply chain issues, forcing them to adopt a more vertically integrated manufacturing process, starting with creating their own electric motor. Jim Farley and Ford have taken notice and are starting to follow Tesla's lead in light of the workers going on strike, the semiconductor shortage, and the pandemic. They chose to take destiny into their own hands.
Might be in the future.
Well, I think this is a new era of vertical integration. We're very much going back to what Henry Ford did in the 20s. And now we're making gearboxes and electric motors. That's great for our labor issue, or because these vehicles are a lot more efficient, 20-30% more to make on the assembly side. So vertical integration is really key for our labor transition, as well as cost.
This change is actually Ford just going back to their roots. Currently, 1,400 suppliers provide Ford with parts to make their cars, but in the early 1900s, Ford controlled most aspects of their supply chain, from the rubber for their tires, to the trucks moving those tires, to even owning their own power plant and steel mill. The question is, what happens to the suppliers and their workers? Every way you look at it, it's truly a lose-lose situation.